Is this the very first?
No.
Like,
You learned
you
it?
guys lectured
Dang,
about?
I thought it'd be the.
I was out of town, remember?
Oh.
Sorry to disappoint.
It is like.
We'll get used to it. But don't go to sleep on me.
Okay, so this is chapter 26 in your book, and it specifically deals with the regulation of water and also solute concentrations. And remember that you actually had a clinical study that you needed to do, which actually dealt with this. And do you remember what if you have too much water intake, what does that cause? Swelling, but it actually has a term. It's called edema, but I was thinking for hyponatremia. So what ion does that refer to? Nope, close though. Natremia. Sodium, right? So the sodium ion. So hypo meant that the sodium ion concentration was too low in your extracellular fluids. And so what that did is it caused the cells to gain water via osmosis, and that led to swelling of the brain, which can lead to things like mental confusion, and then you can pass out and go into a coma and die from that. So we now know that fluid and electrolyte balance is really significant. And so when we talk about the fluid, we are generally talking about a solution. And a solution includes solutes plus a solvent. And the solvent in our body is water. And the two main categories of solutes that we're going to talk about are electrolytes. And so these are things that can carry an electrical charge because they are charged particles. So we can look at the anions, and the anions have a negative charge. And then the cations have a positive charge. So those are charged particles, like sodium, which has a positive charge, and like chloride, which has a negative charge. We can also talk about non-electrolytes. So these are things that do not carry a charge. So for example, glucose is a good example of something that is in solution in our blood, but as well as in solution in the extracellular fluid, and then it goes into the inside of the cell. So that would not carry a charge. And so we'll talk about specifically about the electrolytes and how important they are in regulating water movement between the different parts of the body. Okay. So when we look at the compartments, we can see that we have most of the water is actually in the intracellular fluid. So intra means inside the cells. And so this is abbreviated as the ICF, the intracellular fluid. And I'll show you an image that shows that it makes up about 40% of all of the water in your body is actually inside your cells. And then we have that which is in the extracellular fluid. So this is outside the cells. And so this includes, this is abbreviated as the ECF, but it includes things like the interstitial fluid. So interstitial means between cells. So we know that all of the cells are bathed in water, and they have to be bathed in water in order for things to be able to diffuse in and diffuse out through them. And so the interstitial fluid makes up a big part of that extracellular. And this is where it gets kind of confusing. In your book, they call this the IF. So you need to pay attention to the difference between the ICF and the IF, because they use the abbreviations in your book. And we'll use the abbreviations here as well. So this also includes the blood plasma. So if you take whole blood, remember, and you centrifuge it down like we did in 231, you have a yellow fluid on top, and then you have all the red blood cells in the bottom. So the blood plasma is things that are in solution, and it actually has lots of protein in it as well. So what is the major protein in the blood plasma that allows for osmosis to occur at the venule end of the capillaries? Do you remember what's the major blood plasma protein? It's the same thing that's found in egg whites. Remember? No, albumin. So we talked about that, albumin, right? So albumin is a major protein that's found in the blood plasma. And this would include all other places where there's fluid. So if you think about the serous fluid, so remember that we have fluid in the serous, the pericardial membrane has 2 layers, and then in between, in the space between the heart and the outer layer is serous fluid. We also have a fluid-filled body cavity, or peritoneum. Right? We also have fluid that surrounds our lungs, and that creates that intrapleural pressure that keeps the lungs inflated. Right? We have serous fluid in our joints that help to lubricate and allow for the movement. So that would all be extracellular fluid. So anything that's not inside the cell is considered to be extracellular fluid. So if we look at this, so the average person has about 60% of their body weight is due to the blood. And so the total volume is 40 liters of water in your body. Now, that depends upon a couple of things. It's kind of interesting. When you are born, so a newborn, we look at the water, percent water. When you're a newborn, this is higher. So this could be like 75%. Right? When you're a young male, it's different. And young males are about 60%. And then females are about 50%. And then old people, who's the old people, right? They can be down to 45% of their body is water. So as we age, we become more dehydrated. And that might explain also some of the signs of, aging with wrinkles in your skin, for example, right? So it's just harder to stay hydrated when you're older. So one of the reasons why males have a higher percentage of water than females is that they have more muscle. And muscle cells have lots of water in them, so they kind of store water. So the more muscle you have, the more water you'll have in your body. Females tend to have more fat. And remember that fat is water repelling. So when we look at fat tissue or adipose tissue, it only has like 25% of it is water. So it actually repels the water. So there's not very much water in fat. So the more fat you have, the less percentage of your body weight is actually water. And so then if we look at the intracellular fluid, this is kind of amazing. 25 liters of water is inside your cells. And then interstitial fluid, that's between the cells, is the biggest component of the ECF. And then we have 3 liters of blood plasma. Now, blood itself is about 5 liters, right? But this does not include the cells. So it does not include the red blood cells or the white blood cells.
I have a question about the back of the water thing. If you were to drink like more water than you needed, like just a lot of water per day, would your body create more muscle cells for the water attached to it?
No, but if you weight lift, then you are going to store more water. So you're going to take in more water and store it. Yep. Okay. So we also need to talk about, let me back up here. We also need to talk about the electrolytes. And so this is in the ICF versus ECF. So I'm going to leave a little line here of what's in the, that's an F, in the ICF versus the ECF. So the most abundant anions and cations in the ECF include potassium. So potassium is very abundant. And we also have, we also have phosphate, H in the form of this, -2. Okay, so this would be a cation and this would be the anion. These are the most abundant. We also have a little bit of sodium and chloride in here. And then we have proteins that are negatively charged, including the albumin. So this is most abundant.
What's the HPO?
That's a phosphate. I'm not sure what that, I can't remember exactly what that, just that's how phosphate is stored. So phosphate is an important amino acid, or not amino acid, it's an important atom because we use phosphate, for example, to build bone, because calcium phosphate is the mineral that we find in our bone. Okay, so if you look at the ECF, the most abundant by far is sodium. We also have the most abundant anion is chloride. So this would be what we find in the ECF primarily. There can be other anions and cations, but these are the ones that we're going to talk about. So potassium is at a much lower concentration here. Okay. And so would be the phosphate. So this is most abundant. Okay. Now the significance of these electrolytes is that they actually cause water to move. So if you remember, water can actually move directly across the plasma membrane of a cell. So water will either flow in or flow out depending upon its concentration gradient. So in your book, there is a diagram that shows some other anions and cations. So this just shows in the blood. So the most abundant in the blood plasma, oops, what happened there? Sorry. There we go. So in the blood plasma, we see here that just holding my pen in front of the thing causes it. Okay, there we go. So we see that the most abundant is sodium, and then we see that it's very abundant in the extracellular fluid, but not so abundant in the intracellular. Potassium really abundant, right, in the intracellular, not very abundant in the extracellular fluid. So the plasma actually is also extracellular. Okay. So we can talk about how things move. So sometimes things can move across the capillary walls. So like oxygen and carbon dioxide can simply diffuse across the surface of the cells. So they can diffuse across, remember we talked about this when we were talking about respiration. And CO2 can be given off by the cell and then it can go back to the lungs. We also have nutrients being absorbed, and then water. Notice that water is kind of going back and forth. Nitrogenous wastes are something that we have to get rid of. And so what is an example of a nitrogenous waste? But what is it called? What is it called in our urine?
Urea.
Urea, yeah. So creatinine, urea, and uric acid are all examples of a nitrogenous waste. But the main one in our urine is called urea. Okay, so we're going to talk about the movement of water, and so I just need to review this. And this is called osmosis. So you probably learned extensively about osmosis in cell biology, and a little bit in regular, maybe 231. But when we talk about osmosis, this is passive. And it's water gain or loss directly across the plasma membrane. So water can move directly across the plasma membrane. And it moves with its concentration gradient. So water will move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So things always diffuse from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Now the confusion comes when we start talking about solutes, because we don't have a word for the concentration of water, but rather we use words that are actually the concentration of the solutes. So we have to talk about the relative solute concentrations. So this would be like between the inside and the outside of the cells. So if the solute concentration is lower between two spaces, it is hypotonic. So hypo means lower. Tonic refers to, kind of refers to the tonicity of the cells, so that the cells can become rigid or they can become kind of shrunk, okay? So this is a low solute concentration. And it has to be relative, so it could be compared to the inside versus the outside. Hypertonic is a high solute concentration, and then isotonic is where the solute concentrations are the same. Okay. So what is it called when you get an intravenous solution added to your body? What is it called that it is isotonic? No. You would get added to your body fluids that are, you get packed. What does it say on it? Saline. Okay. So this is the saline, right? And that's because one of the most abundant electrolytes in our body is salt, sodium chloride, right? So a saline solution is isotonic to all of your cells. If you gave a person distilled water, they would die. If you gave them like salt water, like the ocean, they would die, right? So they have to have the right saline concentration so that the water doesn't move into or out of the cells. Giving them hypotonic could actually cause the cells to rupture. So if you put blood and you put it in distilled water, all the blood cells would just immediately rupture and you wouldn't have any blood cells left. Okay. When you put them in salt water, the blood cells shrink down and they shrivel and they become crenellated. So they look all dehydrated and dried up. And that's because they've lost water. Okay,
so then why don't we drink? Like, I mean, obviously our body processes and stuff, but if, you're sick and you're pumping somebody with saline, why don't we drink saline?
We do, and so specifically children who get dehydrated easily through vomiting and diarrhea, for example, what do you give them? Pedialyte. That's a saline solution. Okay. That's with the electrolytes. If you're sick, or how about if you're like exercising outside and you're sweating a lot, you would drink Gatorade rather than water, or you would take water and salt pills. So if you're losing a lot of salt because you're excessively sweating, you have to replenish that salt. So people that work outside during the summer and sweat a lot, they might have little salt tablets with them. So because they crave it, they eat salt so that it will replenish. Yeah. So when you're really sick, you don't want to just drink straight water. You might want to drink, well, Gatorade's got a lot of sugar in it too, but you can drink the Pedialyte solutions that they.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could go get yourself some Pedialyte.
I've drank plenty of that as an adult.
Okay. Okay.
I was 21 once.
Oh yeah, well, that's a good idea.
Oh, it's better than Gatorade.
Yeah.
It's a pretty well used idea nowadays.
They're starting to advertise it like on social media as adult drinks now. Like
I know that you can, they're very expensive. You can have somebody come to your workplace and give you an intravenous.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, so you can pay for somebody to come and give you some saline solution.
Yeah, no, they're like advertising it, like they're making it in like little drink packets now where you can just add it to water. Oh yeah, Pedialyte's just skyrocket.
What's amazing is that I have never felt better than when I get an IV.
It's true.
Like people say, oh, I don't want an IV. I'm like, no, give me an IV because It's like, I have never felt so hydrated, like I don't have, my mouth isn't dry, and I feel so good, and my skin feels so good, and I'm like, oh, I feel so good, and it's like, how come my body doesn't naturally keep me that well hydrated? It seems like you have to get an IV to get like really nice and hydrated.
I'm so bad about drinking water too.
Yeah.
So bad.
Okay,
It just doesn't taste.
so water intake and output. Okay, so obviously when we look at the intake of water, we drink, right? We can also get it in our food. Interestingly, we can also get it through metabolism. And there's actually some desert rodents who get the majority of their water through metabolism. And so in metabolism, when you break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, one of the byproducts is water. So you actually produce water from glucose. And so like kangaroo rats are known to be able to go, they don't ever hardly drink at all. And they just get their water through metabolism. Okay, so if we look at the outputs, one big major one is the lungs, and also across the surface of the skin. So we breathe out, our respiratory membrane has to be moist in order for diffusion to occur. We try to eliminate the water loss by having our respiratory membrane really deep in our body, right? We don't have our respiratory membrane like in our mouth because we'd be constantly losing water, right? So that's why the lungs are so deep in the body, is in order to decrease the output. We also have sweat. So that's a little bit different than just right across the surface of the skin. And then we also have in the output a little bit in the feces, and then a lot in the urine. So urea, nitrogenous wastes are toxic. So we have to have a particular amount, all right, of water that we can get rid of. So we can't not drink water, right? We will become dehydrated. There's no way to maintain homeostatic balance if you're not drinking water, which is why you die faster from dehydration than you would die from not eating, because we don't have stores of water in our body that we can use. Okay, so if we look at the diagram in your book, this just shows how much is lost. So feces, sweat, 28% of the water lost, our output, is through the skin and the lungs, and then urine, that's the minimum output we would use, would be 1,500 milliliters. And then looking at the intake, most of our water obviously is taken in through the beverages. So in order to regulate this, we have a thirst mechanism. And so there are specialized cells called osmoreceptors. And they detect solute concentration in the blood. And the cool thing about these is that they're kind of like muscle cells in that they can detect stretch in the plasma membrane. Right? So if water is lost, okay, it will send a signal to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is our thirst center, also regulates appetite, hunger, also has lots of emotional. Okay, so sends a signal to hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus would then send a signal causing us to want to drink water, right? So it is drink water. interestingly, we also kind of respond to the sensation in our mouth, because as we start to become dehydrated, our mouth will start to dry out. And that sensation of the mouth drying out makes us want to drink, right? So we also have dry mouth. Right? So this is due to a decrease in the saliva production. Okay, so when we are drinking, some things happen. One is that our mouth becomes moist, right? So you stop drinking. Mouth becomes moist. So you produce more saliva. The other thing is that you have stretch receptors in your gut. Right, so those stretch receptors would send a signal that your stomach is filling up and you would want to stop drinking, right? So in order to drink during those contests, when people drink excessive amounts of water, you kind of have to go beyond that. You're like, oh, I can't drink anymore, but you force yourself to drink more, right? And the problem with that is that you drink so much water that your body fluids become too diluted, and then you can go into a coma and die from drinking too much water. Okay. So in your book, there's a diagram that shows this. Okay. So here we're talking about the increase in the solute concentration. So osmolality is just a measure of concentration. The osmoreceptors, right? So once your stomach stretches, it sends a signal back to the hypothalamus to stop drinking, right? And then we also have, when your volume of your blood decreases, then that can also cause the thirst reflex, okay? So the other one is a decrease in blood volume. Okay. Stimulates, ultimately, you don't need to know the direct pathway, stimulates the hypothalamus to produce the thirst sensation. Okay. So as a review, what does ADH stand for?
Generic.
Okay, so this would be the anti-diuretic hormone. And this is the way that our body is able to get rid of excess water or retain water, right? So this allows for facultative water loss. Okay. So if ADH is present, do we produce more urine or less urine? Less urine, okay? So its presence leads to a decrease in urine. Okay. Now, there is another type of diabetes. We briefly talked about diabetes mellitus, but there's a type of diabetes that is called diabetes insipidus. So this is not the diabetes that you would normally think of. So this is a totally different diabetes. It has nothing to do with glucose levels in the blood. So this has to do with a lack of ADH. So the reason why they call it diabetes is that it has some of the same symptoms of diabetes, because if you have a lack of ADH, then you're going to have polyuria. Right? So this is excessive urination. right? And with that excessive urination, you're going to have excessive thirst. Do you remember what thirst is? Probably not. This is kind of weird. Do I even remember how to spell it?
When you say excess urination, do you mean you'll go to the bathroom more amount of times, or the amount of liquid will be greater?
Total. Like, you probably have to go to the bathroom more often
Okay.
as your bladder fills. So you just be like, oh, constantly I have to go pee, I have to go pee. You know, you go in the bathroom and you're peeing a lot, right? And so along with that, you're going to have excessive amounts of thirst. So you're going to have to drink a lot of water.
Does that mean that your body isn't? Would that mean that your body isn't absorbing the right amount of nutrients and everything?
No, it has. This is just due to a posterior pituitary problem.
Oh, okay.
So if your posterior pituitary is not working properly, then you can get something that looks like diabetes mellitus. In that diabetes mellitus, you have to produce a lot of excessive urine to get rid of, because you have solutes, the glucose, right? And then you're really thirsty. And so that's one of the signs of that as well, is that you tend to be extremely thirsty.
It's still being filtered properly through the body.
Yes, it's still being filtered properly. It's just that you're losing too much water. And so you're going to get dehydrated. So you're going to have you're constantly going to be dehydrated because you're getting rid of too much water.
And the other diabetes, you pee off all your glucose, and then you don't have glucose in your body or not to keep going, right?
Yes, so that's why it would drop.
Different than this,
That's different. This is different. This is not mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is glucose.
where you don't have glucose.
yeah, yeah. Diabetes insipidus is just due to the lack of ADH. Yeah, so it's different. So this causes dehydration. So what is dehydration? Dehydration is just an increase in the solute concentrations, right? So it's an increase in what is called osmolality, right? And when the solute concentrations change, then water is going to move in different directions, right? So water moves depending upon its own concentration, so it could move in different directions. So when the solute concentrations increase on the outside, water comes out of the cells. So water will leave the ICF. So ICF stands for intracellular fluid. So it leaves the inside of the cells and the cells shrink up. So this is just a diagram that shows that role of ADH. And remember that ADH specifically affects the collecting ducts of the kidneys and causes aquaporins to be inserted so that more water can be reabsorbed. And that results in an increase in the blood volume, plasma volume, and it results in a decrease in the osmolality. So all of these are negative feedback mechanisms, right? Remember the negative feedback mechanism idea, to maintain the proper solute concentrations. So this could be, you could, for example, you could do a blood test to determine whether or not there was proper solute concentrations in the blood, right? So sodium and chloride. Okay, so one disorder of water balance that we've already talked about is dehydration. Okay. Another one, which is in that clinical trial that I gave you, or clinical case study, was what is called hypotonic hydration. Okay. So this is where you take excessive water, dilutes the interstitial fluid. So that's part of the extracellular fluid, but it's the interstitial, so it's right outside the cell, right? And water is at a higher concentration outside the cell than inside. And water moves into the cell. So if I drew my little cell here, and I'm looking at maybe sodium concentrations or other solutes, just like the total solutes, right? And if I take in too much water, then let me make this a little bit more concentrated, right? It doesn't have to do with the solute concentrations. This is hypotonic. This is hypertonic. But there's actually more water outside here. So water moves from a higher concentration into the inside of the cell, and that causes the whole cell to swell and could actually eventually cause the cells to rupture, right? So water would move in that way. This would be, the inside is hypertonic compared to the outside. But the outside is hypotonic compared to the inside. So remember that these have to do with solute concentrations, not water concentration. So the water concentration is just actually the opposite. So that's why it's called hypotonic hydration. And the most abundant ion that is outside the cell that leads to osmosis is sodium. And so that's why they call it hyponatremia. Right, so this is decreased sodium ion concentration. Okay, so this causes the cells to swell. Edema actually is something a little bit different. Edema is where you have an increase in the amount of water outside the cell. So this is an increase in the interstitial fluid, or the IF. So this causes tissue swelling. Not cellular swelling. So one of the things that, one of the signs of hyponatremia is mental confusion and dizziness and passing out. And that's because your ion concentrations have become so low and your nervous system starts to swell, right? And that puts pressure on the brain. Okay. So this is the diagram that shows the loss or gain of water. So if the ESF osmotic pressure rises, so that would be the concentration of water. Water is going to move in, and then the cell is going to want to get rid of that excess water. Okay. Wait a minute, sorry. Oh, wait a minute, no, I'm sorry. This is the opposite. So cells lose water. So if this is increase in concentration, then the cells will actually lose the water. Okay, so that would be dehydration. And hypotonic hydration is that you have excess gain of water, and so the cells will swell. Okay, so let's talk about sodium. So where is sodium at its highest concentration in the fluid? ICF or ECF? ECF. Okay. So it plays the greatest role in ECF. And the reason why it does is because of a pump called the sodium-potassium pump. So we learned about the sodium-potassium pump when we were talking about active transport in cell biology. And we also learned about the sodium-potassium pump when we were talking about the nervous system. So in this particular instance, sodium is pumped out of the cell, right? And potassium is pumped into the cell. This takes a protein and energy. So it requires a protein and energy. So the significance of this is it keeps the difference in ion concentrations across the membrane of the cells, so that this is really important in producing a nervous impulse or an action potential. So this is important specifically in neurons and in muscle cells. Because remember that muscle cells can become depolarized too, and then sodium floods into the inside of the muscle cell, and then that can give you a stimulus or an impulse. Okay, so if we look at how this is balanced by the kidney. So what hormone did you study for that quiz that causes the reuptake of sodium and hence the reuptake of water? It is produced by the adrenal gland. Aldosterone. Okay. So aldosterone is produced by the adrenal gland, and it increases the uptake, the reabsorption of sodium in the kidney. So it increases sodium reabsorption in the kidney. So when sodium travels, water travels with it. So we also get the increase, so water will move with it. So we increase water reabsorption. Because as sodium moves out of the filtrate, it increases the osmotic concentration or the solute concentration outside, and so water will just automatically flow with. So where water flows, salt follows. Okay, so that's aldosterone. One interesting thing is that there are some hormones that look like aldosterone and actually have some of the same effects. So if we look at other hormones that have similar effects, you'll probably recognize these. Estrogen. So we all as females know that when we get ready to have our period and our estrogen levels rise, then we retain water, right? So estrogen, increase in estrogen causes water retention. And I can always tell when I'm going to get my period because I have to pee all the time to get rid of that excess water that had been storing, right? So we retain water during premenstrual time, and then when we start to menstruate, then we lose all that water. Okay. Another one is glucocorticoids. So an example of a glucocorticoid that you probably have heard of that's synthetic is called prednisone. Right. So glucocorticoids are produced in times of stress, and they also cause water retention. So if you've ever known anybody who's been on prednisone long term, they get puffy looking, right? So they retain water in their body, and they kind of get really puffy looking because of that. So this also causes water retention. And that's one of the signs of if you have Cushing's disease, which is where you have excess production of glucocorticoids. That's one of the signs of that is that your face will swell up and it'll look different, dramatically different over a period of months. All of a sudden you'll start to look different. You also get like a hump on your back. So you get like this edema swelling on the back of your body. Okay. So if we look at some of the effects of this, so we could have hypernatremia, where you have dehydration, right? So if you take in too much sodium, that could be in your diet. So you could take in sodium, in your diet and you're taking in too much. And what that tends to cause is some problems where you have thirst. The central nervous system can become dehydrated, and that can lead to confusion. And so sometimes in older people, specifically, their thirst reflex doesn't work very well. So they don't know to drink. And so old people can get dehydrated really easily, and they have less water in their body anyway, right? And so they get dehydrated easily, and so then they start to get confused, right? And so sometimes you can just cure that by making sure that they stay hydrated, right? So they don't become dehydrated, okay? And so then hyponatremia is what we talked about, where we have water retention, or if we drink excessive amounts of water. You can also get hyponatremia if you lose sodium through vomiting, diarrhea, burned skin, gastric secretions. So sometimes you can lose that, those ions, and then that causes a problem too, specifically in the nervous system, where you get irritability and convulsions. Okay, I'm going to stop there for today, and then we'll talk about the rest of these ions. We have no lab this week, and we are ahead of schedule.